Once upon a time, there was a governor who had the power of life and death over two suspects. One he knew to be a dangerous revolutionary that the crowd loved. The other was an innocent man whom the crowd hated. The governor had to release one of them. Which one should he release? It was obvious he should release the innocent man, no matter what the crowd thinks. He's the ruler. But it's not that simple. Here's the governor's dilemma. The crowd has been conned into believing that the innocent man is bad and the bad man is good. Also, this governor, he wants to rise in power in the government, but his past has been characterized by causing riots by his ruthless control, and the government is not pleased with him. Now, here's the governor's task. Here's what he has to do. If he releases this popular revolutionary that the priests want, he risks a future riot. If he releases the innocent man, he risks a riot right now. He doesn't want either one. What does he do? He needs to outwit the priests. He needs to convince the crowd that the innocent man should be released. It's only justice. What should he do? Now, he's a shrewd man, so he thinks he's figured this out. He wants to save face for the priests. He thinks that they are resisting him because of their pride, so he wants to save face for them. So he figures that if he releases a guy, they have wanted a guy to be released during this festival for years and years and years, maybe hundreds of years. And so he's figured out that if he releases this innocent man, then he is free to execute the criminal. It's a win-win situation. Everybody wins. No riots either way. Pretty sweet plan. Unfortunately, the priests are better con men than he is. This story is summarized in our text today. John is very brief about his reporting. Let's read it. We're going to examine the characters, and these characters are going to give us an important warning about who we should consent to lead us. Here's John 18, 38-40. It says, "What is truth?" said Pilate. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him. Now, you have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now, Barabbas was a revolutionary. That's the text. It's smack in the middle of the story that we're covering about Jesus, the trials of Jesus. This particular one is before Pilate, and Pilate keeps trying to release Jesus. It's pretty interesting. He does not want to send this guy to the cross. Well, there are 5 characters in this brief little scene. We got the Jews, we have Jesus, we have the crowd, we have Pilate, and we have Barabbas. That's all their pictures up there. To understand what's going on here, we need to know about these 5 characters. Now, the character the author calls the Jews are not the whole race of the Jewish people. Everybody in the story is Jewish except for Pilate, so it can't mean that. No, the Jews are the religious leaders, the rulers, the religious rulers, and their followers who are cooperating with Rome. These people cooperate with Rome because they got wealthy jobs out of the deal and they want to keep their jobs. But these people also, the Jews character, they want to replace Pilate because he's so ruthless and incompetent to rule. These rulers, these religious rulers, they're con artists. They've been con artists all the time. They know how to control a crowd. The crowd is a second character. Now, John doesn't emphasize this. The other Gospels have the crowd as one of their main characters. John kind of lumps them in with the Jews in his stories. He says that the Jews, the crowd in the other Gospels, they want an insurrection. They want to rebel against Rome, and they're looking for a leader to lead them against Rome. There have been several of these leaders that have come up and been arrested and killed. And so they keep looking for the next one. The next, they call him a Messiah. This character, the crowd, is the real power in Jerusalem. Because by rioting, this crowd can destroy the careers of anybody who's in charge of them. And all these rulers want to advance, and so the crowd has this control over them because they only govern by consent of the governed. Pontius Pilate's the next character. He was the governor, but he had to have been an able administrator or he never would have been put in there. But the problem is he's not a very good ruler. He's contemptuous of the people. And he's ruthless in his methods of control. Here's a good example. Jerusalem, he learned, lacked an adequate water supply. Not even the temple had enough water to wash away. We talked about their sacrifices and how much blood was around. Well, they had to wash all that away. They didn't have enough water to do it. So he decided he was going to bring in an aqueduct. That's what the Romans do. They build an aqueduct to bring water into the city. But he was going to finance it out of the temple treasury. Big mistake. Big riot. Well, what happened is he took his soldiers, put them in plain clothes, had their knives concealed, and at his signal, they slashed the throats of all the rioters that they had infiltrated there in the streets. Well, word of that debacle got to Rome. Another time shows how Rome regretted putting Pilate in charge. The straw that broke the camel's back actually came about 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. There were Samaritans, and the Samaritans were loyal subjects of Rome, but at one time there was a small group of them who decided to rebel. And what Pilate responded with is he went into a town where a number of these Samaritans were. They were preparing to worship up on Mount Gerizim. And instead of negotiating or doing anything with them, he slaughtered them. He enslaved them, and he chased them out of the town. He destroyed the town. Well, that was the last thing that Rome could do. The Samaritan Senate wrote to Rome and saying, we're not rebelling against Rome. We're trying to escape this ruthless Pilate. And so Rome recalled him. Tiberius recalled him back to Rome, and that was the end of Pilate. So that's that character. This kind of bad report to Rome is just what Pilate is trying to avoid in this story. He doesn't want this kind of thing to get back to Rome. So the religious rulers know this, and they can exploit his fear. Now they have him caught between two saviors, Jesus and Barabbas. They own him. One of those saviors was Barabbas. We don't know much about Barabbas. We do know what was going on in Palestine and what may have been his part in it. It was a time when false messiahs kept cropping up, leading bands of revolutionaries, and the people would get behind them. It's like Robin Hood in our legends from England, stealing from the rich, giving it to the poor kind of thing. And people would get behind him, but then they'd get arrested. Barabbas was the most recent one. To the Jews, he was a guerrilla fighter, a freedom fighter. But to the Romans, he was a bandit and he was a murderer. He was like a marauding soldier gone nuts, a maniac on the loose. It really depends on which side you're on, what you think of these people, freedom fighters or maniacs. Yeah. The crowd had put their hope in Barabbas, but now his militia and him were arrested, so he was kind of out of the picture. He was awaiting crucifixion. So now this other savior pops up from Galilee. This guy actually raises Lazarus from the dead. And he does other miracles all over Jerusalem. And then he rides into Jerusalem like an ancient Hebrew king. This got to be the real deal, this Jesus. And the crowd goes crazy for him. Now, this, of course, makes the religious rulers jealous because they figure this guy is going to take over their control of the people. So finally, the religious rulers are able to corral Jesus at night and conduct their own trial where they condemn him to death. So they take him to Pilate to be executed. Of course, then Pilate's got to interview him. He interviews him, and he realizes that this guy is no threat to Rome. So he comes out, all the Jews waiting for him to declare Jesus to be executed. He comes out and declares him innocent. That's not in the program. Pilate wants to release him. Instead, the religious rulers con the crowd and convince them to call for Jesus' death by execution as if he really were a revolutionary. It's called the big lie. The religious rulers were successful because the crowd was disappointed in Jesus. He did the big entrance, but then he didn't do anything. So they want Barabbas, their real hero. Pilate has been outsmarted by his opponents, the religious rulers. They have convinced the crowd to vote against their own interest and accept a murderer. Crowds can be talked into anything by a good con artist. And the crazy thing about it is the crowd will think it was all their idea. That's why it's such a great con. The crowd will follow anyone who stands up and shouts the loudest and claims to be able to lead them to the promised land. It's a crazy thing crowds do. The people will even think that they are very smart and wise to follow this con artist. Now look at Jesus, the leader they rejected. He was a healer. He was a reconciler. He was a godly man. He didn't shout in the streets. He didn't tell lies. He taught the truth with stories. He reasoned from facts that they all knew and could be verified. He advocated for the poor and the oppressed. He condemned hypocrisy. He was gentle and humble in heart. He trained his followers with patience and love, and they followed him even to death. He was boring. Now, you and I are the crowd. We choose our leaders like the religious rulers, Pilate or Barabbas. Which of these leaders should we choose? Should we choose a leader like Jesus? Let's look at how to choose a leader after God's own heart. The religious leaders were con artists, and all through history, we see their technique being worked out. You see it in the Greek legends. You see it all over the place in history. There's technique. This technique is called the big lie. And the con depends on the dangerous weakness of the crowd. By using the big lie, a con artist can convince a crowd to act against their own self-interest, let alone the interest of everybody else. The big lie was what was used to get Jesus crucified. Now, we got to look at how this con works. It's important. Our country is a good example because this country is ruled by the crowd. That's us. We the people. We're the crowd. The danger appears in this very Declaration of Independence. Here's what it says. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. Did you hear that? Governments rule by consent of the governed. Governments rule by the crowd's consent. The writers of our Constitution were assuming that the governed were informing themselves with facts and thinking rationally and picking the best person to rule them. The danger is that just like the crowd in our story, there will be cunning leaders who can con the governed to consent against their own self-interest. It's the big lie. The world's best con artist describes why this works and why it has worked all through history. This is what he says. He said that it would never enter the minds of most people to tell a colossal lie. So they wouldn't believe that anyone else would tell such a colossal lie to distort the truth so dramatically and completely. No one would do that. Even though you could prove the true facts and expose the big lie, they'll continue to believe there must be something in it or they never would have brought it up. And certainly people wouldn't keep talking about it. So there must be something to it. You see how the big lie works? Have you ever experienced this or heard about it in the news? Have you heard about it from people you've talked to? This is the big lie, the con that works all through history. This is how the religious rulers got the crowd to call for the release of Barabbas and the crucifixion of Jesus. The crowd's decision was utterly against their own self-interest, but they got caught up in this big lie of nationalistic and religious fervor. Jesus taught them to love, but he didn't lead a revolt, so they didn't follow him. They wanted a revolt. He wasn't exciting enough. He was boring. So they followed a hate-filled murderer instead because he fed the anger of the big lie. This is a great con. Now perhaps we can be forewarned. Perhaps we can avoid being swept up with a crowd in any organization we're in. Perhaps knowing the con will help us to know how to consent, who to govern us. Let's look at the kind of person who manipulates people through this big lie con. You can actually identify this kind of person and be forewarned. This kind of person is really a bully in disguise. If we can identify what a bully is like, we might be able to recognize a con artist. I found an excellent article about bullies by Tom Rainier. This is a good, I just kind of signed up for his newsletter. He's got a lot of good stuff to say about how to run a church successfully. And this one is Bullies in the Church. That's what the article was about. But as I looked at it, I realized that this is bullies in any organization or country, any place where humans have to be governed. You can see this kind of con going on, this bully. So I'm going to take us through this list that he gave, and I adapted it for any organization pretty much. It's a kind of person that you need to watch for so that you don't follow this person because it's a con. Okay, here's a list. We can hand this list out. Perhaps we can avoid becoming a bully. That's pretty easy. You get in charge of an organization. It's easy to become a bully and try to con instead of being honest. Maybe we want to stand up to this con artist that we run into. And so this is a good thing. You just might want to hang on to this handout if you get into an organization that seems to be having issues. Okay, here's some ways to identify bullies as con artists. First, they do not recognize themselves as bullies. Instead, they see and they portray themselves as necessary heroes. They have personal and self-serving agendas. They're not really heroes for you. They got their own thing going, and they're going to try and fool you or control you. Number 3, so they seek to form power alliances with people they think are easy to convince. They may have a charismatic personality, they may not. Often it's a charismatic personality. That's how the financial cons happen, like Bernie Madoff and those things. They'll pester you. They'll convince groups and individuals. They won't let it be. They'll just keep at you. They want you to be their ally, and so they end up creating a group of people who become inoculated to any contrary evidence. The members of this committed group will cheer for anything the leader says then, and will reject any contrary evidence, no matter how factual, because they want to be identified with this group. And facts have nothing to do with it anymore. It's, I want to be identified with that kind of people. It has everything to do with identity now, because he's created this group. Bullies tend to have intense and emotional personalities. They use the intensity of their personalities to get their way. People succumb to these forceful personalities because they don't want to confront them. They don't want to confront their followers. So nobody stands up. Bullies are famous for inferring, if not actually saying, everybody is saying this. That's what they want you to believe, that everybody is saying this. Just like a teenager, you know. They'll use that, everyone, instead of real evidence. They love to gather tidbits of information. We call it cherry picking, right? Tidbits of information, and then they shape it to their own agendas. They repeat their lie over and over and over until people say of the lie, there must be something to it, or they wouldn't keep saying it, or they wouldn't have brought it up in the first place, so there must be something to it, even though there's nothing to it and it's a big lie. The con artist will even ask leading questions as if there were facts being hidden without having to prove any facts. You see this, commentators and pundits, they like to do this. They ask insinuating, suggestive questions, even though there's nothing there. And the question puts this doubt in your head. 6, they find their greatest opportunities in people who seek to get their own needs and preferences fulfilled. It works because these people will believe whatever satisfies them or agrees with them. People will even deny that the bully is going to carry out his threats. Here's what they do. They take this outrageous claim and they spin it for what they want it to say, for what they want it to believe. And then they believe their own understanding of what the bully said. The bully never said it. They're believing what they have reinterpreted what the bully said. Then they will believe he is saying just what we have been thinking. 7, they're allowed to bully because people will not stand up to them. If someone does stand up to them, the bully will ridicule them in the basest manner, on the order of a schoolyard bully telling a girl, for a fat girl, you don't stink much. 8, they rely on stimulating emotion rather than facts that will hold up to scrutiny. 9, they create chaos and create havoc in any organization. They are not content unless they are exerting the full force of their manipulative behavior to win at any cost. This results in burning their bridges until they leave the organization a smoldering wreck. Have you seen this? I've been in churches where I see this. I've been in organizations where I've seen this. I've seen it in our country. In the end, Israel was destroyed by this con of the religious leaders. All of Israel, all of Jerusalem was leveled because the result of this con. The tragedy is that most people stand silent and let it happen. Let's not be that bully. This is, for a pastor hearing this, this is a temptation for a pastor to become this kind of con artist. Let's not be this kind of bully in our organization. But let's not put up with bullies. And let's not vote for con artists. Be aware. Let's vote for leaders like Jesus. You know, any other leader than one that's like Jesus is not God's will for us. Let's not vote for them. Let's not follow them. Let's not be them. The only way to vote in God's will is to vote for leaders like Jesus. Selfless leaders who care primarily about the people they're leading. May God guide us in this election season in our choices of pastors and leaders of organizations that we're part of, that we will work within God's will. Amen.